He got a job as a forest ranger and found a normal door in a rock during his first week. Behind it was a lived-in room and an elderly man who seemed to have been living there for decades. But the more often the ranger returned, the clearer it became that this man knew something that no one else should know. Watch until the end and write in the comments which city you are from. Subscribe and share this video. The truck rumbled through the last narrow stretch of the mountain road, its tires spitting gravel into the air as Luke Harper guided it along the serpentine path. The world around him seemed to fold in on itself, dense walls of pine and spruce pressing close to the road, their tips swaying slightly against the low gray clouds. The scent of wet earth seeped through the open window, and for the first time in months, Luke felt that strange, hollow quiet that came only in places far removed from the hum of cities. He parked at the clearing where his new post stood, a small wooden cabin with a tin roof dulled by years of rain. The Forest Ranger's quarters, they called it, in the assignment papers. To him, it looked like a refuge built at the edge of the world. He had taken this position to disappear, or perhaps to start over. It was hard to tell which. The last station had ended badly. He could still hear the echo of a gunshot, the weight of a mistake that wasn't entirely his, but enough to stain his record. So when the Montana Parks Division offered him this post in a district that barely existed on any current map, he signed the papers the same day. A place with no people, no noise, no questions. That was all he needed. The first days passed quietly. Luke spent them checking the boundaries of the reserve, repairing broken trail signs, and taking inventory in the old storage shed. The map pinned to his cabin wall was dated 1984, printed in faded green ink. He marked the streams, the ridges, and the winding roads with careful notes in pencil. But there were areas that simply didn't exist anymore. Paths that ended abruptly. Valleys where the topography had changed, as if the land itself had shifted. He noted them, curious, but didn't yet explore further. At night, the forest had its own language. The wind moved through the branches in long breaths, and somewhere far up the ridge, an owl called, its voice distant and lonely. Luke would sit on the porch with a tin mug of coffee, listening to the silence between the sounds. It was almost peaceful, except for a faint pressure that seemed to build the longer he stayed, a sense that the forest was aware of him, watching, measuring, remembering. On the fourth day, he drove down to the nearby settlement for supplies. The general store was little more than a wooden shack with a faded sign that read, Hollow Ridge Trading. An elderly woman stood behind the counter, her gray hair tied back with a scarf. When Luke mentioned his new post, she stopped what she was doing and looked up sharply. "They still send people up there?" she asked. "Apparently," he replied with a half-smile. "Guess it's been a while." The woman didn't smile back. She reached for a pack of matches and slid it across the counter with a quiet sigh. "Don't go to the North Slope," she said finally. "The trees don't grow right there." Luke raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing," she said quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Just don't go." The next morning, he found an old survey map inside a drawer of the cabin. Someone before him, another ranger, perhaps, had drawn a thick red circle around a section of the ridge and written in shaky letters, "Do not patrol." Next to it was a date 1973. Luke stared at it for a long time. That was over 50 years ago. Whatever reason there once was had surely long faded into myth. He told himself he'd respect the boundary, at least until he learned more. But the forest had a way of luring curiosity. On the 7th day, while following a stream northward, he noticed his compass needle spinning aimlessly. The GPS unit blinked. No signal. The air grew heavy, muffled, like a pressure against his skin. He should have turned back, but instead, he climbed higher along the slope until the trees thinned and the rock face appeared before him. At first, he thought it was just a natural crack in the mountain. Then he realized it wasn't. A rectangular outline, too perfect, too deliberate, stood out against the stone. He brushed away a layer of moss and felt smooth wood beneath his fingers. It was a door. Not a cave entrance or a mine shaft. An ordinary wooden door, fitted perfectly into the granite wall, with rusted hinges and a small brass handle dulled by time. Luke's pulse quickened. He looked around, half expecting someone to be there. But there was only the stillness of the mountain. He turned the handle gently. To his surprise, it moved easily, as if freshly oiled. The door opened inward with a sigh of stale air. The space beyond was small and dim. Sunlight from the doorway fell across a simple wooden table, a cot with folded blankets, and a kerosene lamp resting beside an open book. Dust motes floated lazily through the air, but the room was far from abandoned. There was a faint smell, coffee, metal, something human. On the table sat a mug, half full, the liquid still dark. Luke's breath caught in his throat. Someone lived here. He stepped inside cautiously, scanning the corners. Along one wall stood a radio receiver, old but functional, its dial frozen at a single frequency. A quiet hiss filled the air, steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. He adjusted the knob, but the sound didn't change. Beneath the noise, he thought he heard something else. A faint pattern, a pulse. 3 beats, pause. 2 beats, pause. He leaned closer, unsure whether it came from the radio or from deep within the stone itself. A wave of unease passed through him. The place didn't feel dangerous, but it didn't feel right either. It felt watched. He turned off his flashlight and stood in the dimness for a moment, listening. Then he backed out, closed the door, and stepped into the forest again. The silence hit him like a wall. He returned the next day, this time bringing a small thermos and a notebook. The door looked the same, as if nothing had changed. He sat on a rock a few yards away, waiting. Hours passed. The forest shifted from morning brightness to the deep amber of evening, and still no one came. He was just about to leave when he heard footsteps crunching through the leaves. An older man emerged from the shadows of the trees, carrying a weathered rucksack and a rifle slung over one shoulder. His face was tanned and lined, his beard silver against his sun-darkened skin. He stopped when he saw Luke, but his expression showed neither surprise nor fear, only quiet recognition. "You're the new ranger," he said after a moment, his voice calm, almost kind. Luke nodded. "Yeah. Sorry if I—" The man raised a hand. "No need to apologize. You found what you were meant to find." He walked past Luke and opened the door. The hinges made no sound. The man glanced over his shoulder once more. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly. "Not yet." "Why? What is this place?" The old man looked at him for a long moment before replying. "It's older than your maps. Older than this forest in some ways. I keep it safe because no one else remembers why it was built." Luke hesitated. "Who are you?" "Someone who stayed behind." The man disappeared inside and closed the door. For a long time, Luke stood there, staring at the rough wood, half expecting it to open again. It didn't. He returned to his cabin that night, unable to shake the encounter from his mind. The radio on his table, usually silent, began to emit a faint static, hum steady, rhythmic, the same pulse he had heard inside the mountain. 3 beats, pause. 2 beats, pause. It followed him into his sleep, like the heartbeat of the land itself. In his dream, he stood again before the door. Only this time, the rock around it was moving, breathing. The moss rippled like living skin, and the air tasted of iron. From within, a voice whispered words he couldn't understand, low and ancient, and when he reached for the handle, he saw that his own reflection stared back from the brass, older and more tired than before. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. Outside, the forest was silent, waiting. The map on the wall fluttered slightly in the draft, as though some invisible hand had brushed against it. In the pale light of morning, the red circle marked "Do Not Patrol" seemed darker than before. The pencil line freshened overnight. Luke sat at the table, poured himself black coffee, and opened his journal. On the first blank page he wrote, "There is a door in the rock. Someone lives inside. He says I wasn't supposed to find it." He stared at the words, then underlined the last sentence twice before closing the book. The day ahead stretched long and uncertain. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the forest waited, breathing slowly, listening for his next step. And as the sun climbed behind the mountains, Luke Harper felt that the silence surrounding him was no longer empty. It was expectant, as though the land itself had begun to remember his name. For several days after his first encounter with the old man, Luke tried to convince himself that the whole thing had been nothing more than a trick of fatigue and solitude. The mountains could play with one's mind. He had heard that before from veterans of the service. People who lived too long without company often saw faces in the trees and heard whispers in the wind. It was easy to rationalize it that way, yet the proof on his notebook page and the echoing pulse from his cabin radio refused to fade. Each night, the same steady rhythm: 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, seeped through the static as if the forest itself were breathing through the wires. He couldn't let it go. Every morning, while performing his rounds, Luke found his gaze drawn toward the northern ridge where the door stood hidden. He told himself that he would stay away, that he would not interfere with whatever secret the man was guarding. But the thought lingered until it became a quiet obsession. One afternoon, unable to resist any longer, he packed a thermos, a flashlight, and his journal, and followed the path back toward the stone face. The air felt heavier than before, saturated with a stillness that pressed against his ears. When he reached the clearing, the door was shut again, exactly as he had left it. He approached slowly and saw something that hadn't been there before: a small folded note placed beneath a rock beside the entrance. He crouched and picked it up. The paper was rough, yellowed, and the handwriting sharp and deliberate. "Listen. Don't look." The message unsettled him more than it should have. He looked up instinctively at the forest surrounding him, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone nearby. He stood there for several minutes, feeling strangely like a trespasser in a place that was not meant to exist. Eventually, he left the note where it was and walked back down the slope, glancing over his shoulder more than once. That night, the pattern returned, louder than before. He could hear it even when the radio was switched off, resonating faintly in the wood of the cabin walls. At some point, he fell asleep in his chair and dreamed of water dripping onto stone, of a voice counting numbers he couldn't understand. When he awoke, dawn was just breaking, and the scent of rain filled the air. 3 days passed before he saw the old man again. The forest had begun to shift with the early signs of spring. The streams ran higher, the wind softer. Luke had started to notice odd things: circles carved into tree bark, patches of ground where moss grew in perfect spirals, and birds that avoided certain parts of the canopy altogether. He began marking these spots on his map, and the pattern that formed was unsettling. The points all curved around a single center, the ridge where the door lay. On the 5th morning, while crossing a wooden bridge near the river, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning quickly, he saw Garrett standing a few yards away, wearing the same weathered coat and wide-brimmed hat. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of humor in his eyes, as though he had expected Luke all along. "You don't listen very well," Garrett said quietly. Luke swallowed the sharp edge of surprise. "I found your note. And yet, here you are, still looking. I'm not trying to cause trouble. There are things here I don't understand." Garrett studied him for a moment, then turned toward the direction of the ridge. "Understanding is the last thing you should want here. Walk with me." They followed a narrow trail that wound between old pines. The higher they climbed, the quieter the forest grew, until even their footsteps seemed muffled. Garrett moved with the calm precision of someone who knew every root and stone by heart. After a while, they came to a low stone bridge spanning a dry ravine. The bridge was ancient, its surface covered in moss, the stones beneath it grooved by the memory of water long gone. Garrett stopped halfway across and looked out over the empty gorge. "Before you were born, men built things here that had no place in nature," he said. "They called it research. The government wanted to listen to the earth itself, to measure its breathing, its pulses. They thought they could map it, control it, maybe even predict what it would do. They built machines that could hear what no ear should. And one day, the mountain answered." Luke felt a chill run down his spine. "Answered?" Garrett's eyes flicked toward him. "You think the earth doesn't speak? You think it doesn't remember?" He touched the railing, his hand trembling slightly. "It remembers everything. The machines woke something that should have been left sleeping. I stayed because someone had to. They left their mess behind, and I became its keeper." They continued walking in silence until they reached the clearing where the door waited. Garrett stopped near it but didn't open it. "Whatever you hear from now on," he said, "remember this. It's not about sound, it's about recognition. Once you hear it, it hears you." The man's words followed Luke all the way back to the cabin. That night, when he turned on his radio, the static shifted. Beneath the usual pulse, there was a faint murmur, his own voice, echoing phrases from his journal. He froze, staring at the device as his recorded thoughts spilled through the static in distorted fragments. When he unplugged the radio, the whisper continued for several seconds before fading away. The logical part of his mind insisted there had to be an explanation, some kind of frequency reflection, maybe interference from military transmissions. Yet the fear in his chest was not rational. He felt seen. A week passed. Garrett visited occasionally, appearing at unexpected moments along the trails. He spoke sparingly, always in riddles, but Luke began to realize that the man's solitude was not madness, it was duty. The door, the radio, the shifting pulse in the earth, everything was connected to something buried deeper. Each time Luke pressed for details, Garrett deflected the question. "The less you know, the longer you'll last," he would say. One afternoon, Garrett finally allowed him inside the rock chamber again. The air inside was cooler, humming with a faint vibration that seemed to come from the very walls. The old man lit the kerosene lamp, and the light revealed more than Luke had seen before. Along one side of the room stood a row of instruments. Metal consoles, switches, old analog gauges whose needles still twitched faintly. The faint green glow of a small monitor flickered in the corner. Garrett rested a hand on the nearest console, almost reverently. "This is what's left of the station," he said. "It was called Project Echo Depth. We built it to monitor seismic frequencies, to record the heartbeats of the planet. But it started recording more than that." Luke ran a hand across the dusty surface of one panel. "You're saying this thing is still running?" "Not running. Breathing," Garrett replied. "It listens to us, to every movement, every sound. When you stood outside that first day, it heard you too." As he spoke, one of the gauges flickered, responding faintly to the rhythm of Garrett's words. Luke stared, hypnotized. It wasn't possible. There was no power, no connection to the grid. The air itself seemed alive, filled with invisible motion. "Why didn't anyone shut it down?" Luke asked. "They tried," Garrett said. "And when they did, half the mountain cracked open. It took them 3 days to seal the tunnels. I stayed behind to make sure it never wakes again." They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound, the quiet tick of metal cooling in the lamplight. Luke felt a strange pull fear mixed with awe. He wanted to understand, but the more Garrett spoke, the less human the truth became. When Luke returned to his cabin that night, he found new carvings on the trees near his porch, concentric rings, with lines radiating outward like sound waves. They hadn't been there that morning. The forest around him was shifting, rearranging itself in ways he couldn't explain. The radio's hum grew softer, more melodic, almost like a lullaby. He began to dream of the mountain, of a dark corridor stretching beneath the stone, of faint lights pulsing like a heartbeat. Sometimes he heard Garrett's voice calling from below, calm and patient, telling him to remember the pattern. Other times, the voice was his own. The following week, he tried to contact headquarters, intending to report unauthorized habitation on park grounds. The radio transmitter failed each time. Static filled the channel, and the words he spoke came back to him seconds later, twisted and distorted. Even the satellite phone refused to connect. It was as if the mountain itself was intercepting his attempts. One evening, while taking a final walk before sunset, Luke saw a glow on the ridge where the door stood. It was soft, almost like lamplight bleeding through the cracks of the stone. The sight both terrified and drew him in. He knew he should report it, but there was no one left to tell. The next morning, he found Garrett waiting near the path that led up the slope. The man looked weary, his hand stained with something that shimmered faintly under the light. "It's stirring again," he said. "You've been listening too long." Luke felt the truth in his words even before he spoke them. He had felt the pulse for days now, not through machines, but in his own veins, syncing with his heartbeat. Garrett placed a hand on his shoulder. "It won't stop now. Once it recognizes a mind, it holds on. You'll start to see things that aren't yours. Don't fight them. They're not meant to harm. They're memories. The forest remembers." That night, Luke sat awake until dawn, watching the tree line through the cabin window. The forest was utterly still, but the sense of presence was unmistakable. He opened his journal and wrote page after page, trying to capture what he'd seen, what he'd felt. The words came in a rush, sentences without meaning, diagrams of circles and waves. When he finally stopped, he realized that his handwriting had changed, narrower, sharper, almost identical to the one he had seen on Garrett's note. The realization left him trembling. Something inside this mountain was rewriting him, tuning him to its frequency. The door, the man, the sound, they were all part of the same living system. He closed the journal, extinguished the lantern, and lay back in the darkness. The hum rose again, deep and resonant, flowing through the ground beneath him. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled, but he knew it wasn't the sky. It was the mountain breathing. When dawn came, he found himself drawn once more toward the ridge. The forest greeted him with silence. The air was warm, almost electric, and the moss under his boots pulsed faintly, as if echoing his heartbeat. When he reached the clearing, the door stood slightly ajar, the smell of earth and old metal wafting from within. Garrett was gone. The radio inside hummed softly, repeating the same rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. A message, a warning, or perhaps a welcome. Luke stood there for a long time, unable to decide whether to enter or run. The choice, he realized, might already have been made for him. As he turned to leave, a faint whisper rose from behind the door, so quiet it could have been wind. But it spoke his name, slowly, deliberately. And in that moment, Luke understood that whatever waited beyond the stone had finally recognized him. He didn't go back to the cabin that night. The forest, it seemed, had found its new listener. The morning after the whisper called his name, Luke awoke to a silence so deep it felt like pressure on his chest. The forest was still, unnaturally still, as though the entire valley were holding its breath. His hands trembled when he reached for his notebook and found that the last page he had written the night before was soaked with water, though the roof above him didn't leak and there had been no rain. The ink had bled into the paper, forming shapes that resembled waveforms, curved lines that pulsed outward from a single center. When he looked closer, he thought he could see the faint outline of the ridge where the door stood, drawn not by him, but by some trembling hand he didn't remember guiding. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was exhaustion, dehydration, isolation. But as he stepped outside, he realized something had changed. The birds were gone. The usual chorus of morning calls had vanished. The air was thick and damp, humming faintly in his ears, as if filled with low-frequency vibration. The forest felt heavier now, older, as though it had drawn itself closer, folding around him. He decided to go back to the ridge. He couldn't explain why, only that the need to see that door again had become unbearable, like a compulsion written into his bones. The path, once familiar, seemed altered. The trees leaned in at unfamiliar angles, the moss brighter, almost luminous under the morning light. The deeper he went, the more he noticed how the sound of his own breathing began to synchronize with the faint pulse that still throbbed beneath the ground. When he reached the clearing, the door stood open. The air spilling from within was cooler, metallic, carrying the scent of oil and old earth. He hesitated on the threshold, staring into the dimness that stretched beyond. The space looked different now, larger, deeper, alive. The single chamber had become a passageway descending into the rock, its walls lined with faintly glowing filaments that pulsed in rhythm with that same impossible heartbeat. "Garrett," he called, his voice echoing weakly. No answer, only the slow exhale of wind from the corridor below. He tightened the straps of his backpack, flicked on his flashlight, and stepped inside. The descent was gradual but endless. The steps, carved into the rock, were slick with condensation. Along the walls, remnants of human work appeared: rusted rails, broken lamps, faded signage that hinted at a facility long buried. Some rid environmental monitoring facility in flaking paint. The symbols beside them were half erased, but he could make out numbers, codes, and the unmistakable logo of the United States government. The deeper he went, the louder the hum grew, no longer just sound, but vibration coursing through the soles of his boots and into his bones. He emerged into a vast underground hall. The flashlight beams swung across rows of metal consoles and heavy generators, their surfaces mottled with rust. Old cables snaked across the floor like veins. Dust lay thick everywhere, except for a narrow path cleared through the center, as though someone had been walking here recently. At the far end of the hall, a faint glow emanated from a cluster of machinery. Luke approached slowly, heart hammering. There, half illuminated by the sickly green light of dying monitors, stood Garrett. He looked frailer, smaller somehow, but his posture was steady. He didn't turn when Luke called his name, only said softly, "I told you not to listen too closely." Luke's voice cracked. "What is this place?" "The heart," Garrett replied. "The part they sealed, the part that never stopped breathing." Luke stepped closer, taking in the sight of the machinery that surrounded them. It was unlike anything he'd seen before, a hybrid of old analog panels and organic-looking structures embedded directly into the stone. The rock seemed to have grown around the equipment, fusing with it. Some parts pulsed faintly, as if veins beneath the surface carried light instead of blood. Garrett turned then, his face pale and drawn, eyes glinting with exhaustion. "It's awake again. I tried to keep it quiet, but you opened the path when you found me. It knows your name now. It's been calling you." "What do you mean it?" Luke whispered. Garrett gestured to the walls around them. This mountain was once dormant, just stone and silence. When they built this station, they drilled too deep, reached something beneath the crust. It wasn't alive the way we understand life, but it listened. It remembered. And when the machines began to record, it began to speak back. Luke shook his head. "That's impossible." "Everything is impossible until it isn't," Garrett said. When the first team realized what they'd done, they tried to shut it down. The earth shook for 3 days. The valley cracked open. The survivors buried it under tons of concrete and rock, but something always remained. It needed a listener to stay dormant, someone it could speak through. That became me. Garrett turned toward a large cylindrical structure at the center of the room, a glass pod, cracked but still intact. Inside it, faint blue light shimmered like trapped lightning. "This is the conduit," he said. "The first interface they built. It's what keeps the resonance from spreading. Without it, the energy beneath will climb until it reaches the surface again. And if that happens..." He didn't finish the sentence. Luke stared at the pod, mesmerized by the flicker of light. "What can we do?" Garrett smiled faintly, the gesture tinged with sadness. "It's not we, it's me. I've kept this system alive all these years by linking myself to it. My body's failing now. It's drawing too much from me. When I go, it will start searching for another. It's already found you." Luke felt the world tilt, nausea rising in his throat. "No, there has to be another way." "There isn't," Garrett said simply. "It needs balance one life to keep it sleeping. If no one takes the link willingly, it will feed by force. You've heard it, haven't you? The voice, the heartbeat. It's been testing you, tuning you. You were never just observing, Luke. You've been answering." For a moment, Luke could only stare, the enormity of it pressing down on him. The idea that the mountain, the earth itself, was alive, or worse, conscious, was madness. Yet everything around him hummed with undeniable life. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor trembled like the pulse of an enormous creature. Garrett walked toward a control panel and placed his hand on a lever corroded with age. "I'm going to end it," he said. "It's time. I've kept it contained long enough. You need to leave before I do." Luke stepped forward. "Wait. You said if it loses balance..." "It will die," Garrett interrupted. "And with it, me. But that's better than what happens if it wakes completely." He looked up, his eyes reflecting the soft blue light. "Promise me you'll stay above ground. Don't come back down. Let it rest." Luke wanted to stop him, to argue, but Garrett had already pulled the lever. The sound that followed was not mechanical. It was organic, a deep groan that rippled through the walls and the ground beneath their feet. The lights flickered, flared, and then dimmed as if the entire mountain exhaled. Garrett staggered, gripping the edge of the console. The glow from the pod intensified, flooding the chamber in pale light. Through the glare, Luke could see shapes moving within the glass fluid, shifting, like silhouettes trapped in liquid. Garrett turned toward him one last time, his face strangely peaceful. "Remember what I told you," he said softly. "The forest keeps its memories. You'll carry them now." Then the light consumed everything. Luke woke lying on the floor, the air thick with dust and silence. The hum was gone. The consoles were dead, the screens blank. Garrett's body lay motionless near the control panel, his hand still resting on the lever. The glass pod had gone dark, its surface webbed with cracks. He staggered to his feet, calling Garrett's name, but there was no response. The man who had lived inside the mountain for decades was gone. He stumbled back toward the stairway, his legs trembling. The tunnels felt different now, colder, emptier. The faint vibrations that had always accompanied him were gone, leaving only the hollow echo of his footsteps. When he emerged into the daylight, the forest greeted him with the first breath of wind he had felt in weeks. It swept across the trees in a soft sigh, and for a moment he thought he heard a whisper in it. Garrett's voice, calm and distant. By the time Luke returned to his cabin, night was falling. He lit a lantern, though the air outside seemed brighter than usual, filled with an almost imperceptible shimmer. Exhaustion overtook him, but as he drifted into sleep, the earth beneath the floorboards pulsed once faintly, but enough to make the lamp flame tremble. He opened his eyes to the sound of soft static. The old radio, the one he had long since unplugged, sat quietly on the table. Its speaker emitted a low hum, irregular, broken. He approached slowly, and as he did, the static shifted into something else. A familiar rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause. The same heartbeat that had haunted him since the day he found the door. But this time, beneath it, he heard a voice. Not Garrett's, not quite human, but unmistakably aware. You kept it safe, it said, almost a sigh. Now let it grow. He didn't move for a long time. Outside, the night was alive with sound again. Frogs, crickets, the soft rustle of wind through leaves. The forest had returned to life, but it was not the same. It felt denser, more watchful, as if the boundary between the living and the listening had vanished. Weeks passed. Rangers from the nearest post visited once to check on him after the communication blackout, but Luke told them nothing. He said the equipment had failed, that the area was clear. They left him there, content with his report. He stayed because he couldn't leave. The mountain had changed him, left something inside him humming in quiet harmony with the land. Sometimes, late at night, he would tune the radio to the dead frequency and sit in the dark, listening. The static was soft, comforting now. And in the whisper of the signal, he could almost hear Garrett's voice murmuring across the airwaves, guiding him, or perhaps simply keeping him company. When spring came, the first signs of new growth appeared along the northern slope. Ferns sprouted from cracks in the rock, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Species that no biologist had ever recorded began to take root. The air smelled different, richer, as if charged with new life. The locals in the valley whispered about it, calling it a miracle, but Luke knew better. Sometimes walking through the forest, he would stop and listen. Beneath the bird song and rustling leaves, there was always that faint heartbeat, steady and patient. It no longer frightened him. It was a reminder that the earth, too, was alive and aware, and that somewhere, deep beneath the stone, the memory of everything that had ever breathed still lingered, waiting for someone to hear. On certain nights, when the wind came down from the ridge, he would catch the faint aroma of coffee drifting through the pines, and in the hum of the radio, soft and steady, a voice would whisper his name, not as a warning, but as a greeting. The mountain was at peace now, and so was he. If this story stayed with you, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes that every place holds a story worth remembering.